Hi everyone, today I'm going to take a quick look at Grand Hotel Abyss by Stuart Jeffries. Subtitle is The Lives of the Frankfurt School. So this is in the history/biography category. So I'm going to comment a little bit on the main idea, the main topic, the research behind Jeffries' work, the readability of the book as a whole, and then I'll end by talking about some things that I learned generally about through the process of reading this, in the hopes that maybe it'll give you a good sense of whether or not it's a book you might want to pick up. So first, the title, really quickly. The title actually comes from a very sharp critique that was leveled at the Frankfurt School, which is the academic philosophical stream out of which comes critical theory. Side note, not critical race theory, that's something different, but critical theory more broadly. 1930s-ish is kind of when it came to be. And so the Frankfurt School was this collection of philosophers that were mostly German Jewish intellectuals that were based in Frankfurt and then eventually kind of went in exile in the World War II Nazi era to America. Produced a ton of writings, major influence on particularly academia and the university in the West, in kind of the capitalist modernistic West, and populated by people like Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Walter Benjamin, and then later on Jürgen Habermas was kind of the second generation. So maybe you've heard those names, maybe you've heard the term critical theory thrown around, maybe even you've heard the term Frankfurt School thrown around. I picked this up because terms like critical theory, and especially the term cultural Marxism, and a general kind of skepticism or outright condemnation of like the progressive left that's coming out of academia and is being labeled as cultural Marxist thinking. All of that stuff is kind of flowing around in our discourse right now, late 2020 as I record this. And so I picked up Jeffries' book here because I wanted to learn a little bit more about what critical theory actually is, and also kind of the history out of which it comes, what the context of it is. And more about just those particular figures that I just listed. That's why I picked the book up and wanted to learn about all those things. I'll say more about that in a minute. But I'm going to get back to the title. I mentioned Grand Hotel Abyss. It's an intriguing choice for a title because it actually comes from a critique of the Frankfurt School by a philosopher, thinker, writer named Lukács, who basically said that the Frankfurt School, they occupied this grand hotel over an abyss. In a sense, he was saying that they loved to critique the world that they lived in. They loved to critique capitalism in particular. But they lived in their comfortable grand hotel while they did it. So they lived in a hotel that was overlooking the abyss that they were critiquing. And so that's where Jeffries got that title from. And that's the premise of the book, is essentially who are these people that make up the Frankfurt School, who influenced their thought, what were their lives like, and why did they write what they did, and what's the history there. So it's kind of a group biography in that sense. It's a biography of all of these thinkers and how their lives intersect and how critical theory emerged out of that kind of milieu. So that's what the concept of the book is. It's the main idea of it. And the research behind it, what Jeffries did is, the research is very, very impressive. He pulls a lot on the writings of the members of the Frankfurt School, frankly. I mean, he pulls a lot on their famous writings and their not so famous writings, articles, essays, letters, obviously books, things like Dialectics of Enlightenment, so on and so forth, which was by Horkheimer and Adorno. And throughout the book, which it's arranged strictly chronologically, it goes decade by decade, really kicking off kind of mostly in the 20s and then going through the 60s. So when he quotes primary sources especially, he does a great job of noting it and pointing to where it comes from if you want to chase down more information of the context of the quote and the context of the thinking. And also, importantly, he includes critiques of the Frankfurt School. He includes critiques that were being brought up, especially at the time of their writings. And so in that sense, I found the research pretty well balanced. It's not like this is not like an apologetic for critical theory per se. It's really just the story of it. It's very, very well-rounded, very nuanced, very, very honestly balanced. I found it to be quite balanced in that sense. So it's a little bit about the research. And then last thing I'll say about the research that I really appreciated, and I personally love when books like this do this, which is he included a for further reading section in the back, which is not just the bibliography, it's not just the works he particularly used, but it's just a general resource of if you want to learn more about Herbert Marcuse, if you want to learn more about kind of intro to critical theory thought in general, here's lists of books to check out. So that's included at the end. I love when books do this. I find it so helpful because when my interest gets sparked, I love to know where to go right away without necessarily combing through the end notes. So he included that there. Really appreciated that. The readability of this it's generally very readable, I would say. It is an interesting mix of history, of biography, and of philosophy. The history and biography slices are bigger than the philosophical slice of the book. I don't know what percentages would be. I'd say it's maybe like 60% to 2/3 history and biography and about 1/3 philosophy, intro to philosophy. But it really does tell the story of the lives of the people in this school, Frankfurt School, but also the history behind them. So as he's talking about the 20s and 30s in Germany, you get a historical kind of introduction to what was happening in Germany and Europe at the time. Same when they moved to America, especially in the 50s and then the protests of the 60s and such. So it's a lot of that history and it's a lot of that biography, and when it's a narrative in that way, it's like compulsively readable. There are certain chapters, particularly I would say on Walter Benjamin, who led probably the most tumultuous or maybe dramatic life. His story is just really gripping in that sense, so it's really easy reading. As Jeffries weaves in and out of the philosophy and kind of explaining and unpacking some of the ideas of the critical school or critical theory thinkers, that's when maybe, depending on your comfort level with philosophy, especially critical theory, that's when it may grind down a little bit for you. You may get a little bit slower. But it's not bad. It's really not bad. I don't want to overstate that. He does a good job, I would say, generally keeping in the context of the story, introducing thought, and then going back into the history. So I found it overall readable. It is a little bit on the longer side, just know that going into it, because it does cover a wide, multiple decades of history and trying to bring in biography and trying to bring in philosophy. So it's kind of a big scope in that sense. So a little bit on the long side, but generally I found it quite readable. And then finally, just some things I learned about. I learned about the history of that era. I learned a lot of things about those decades, particularly in Germany and Europe. Related to that, I learned about the context of critical theory. I learned really where it sprang out of. And in that sense, I learned exactly what I was hoping I would learn from reading this, which is, why did critical theory emerge? And essentially, critical theory emerged because these German thinkers, most of them Jewish, were trying to understand why did the communist revolution in Russia succeed. You could argue about the success of that, right? But just why did the revolution implement its goals? Why did it accomplish its goals in Russia but not in Germany? Because a similar revolutionary attempt kind of happened but failed. And why did that happen in Germany? Trying to diagnose what was going on culturally that kind of inhibited that revolutionary attempt. That's really where critical theory comes from, is trying to understand that. Why did that revolution fail in Germany? And that's a fascinating thing. Also, I learned about the influences on critical theory beyond just Marx. And this is where, maybe a whole video on why my frustrations with the term cultural Marxism, but they were actually quite influenced by thinkers like Freud as well. And actually, they were quite critical of Marx in some key respects, and they really disagreed with each other in lots of respects. So there's a critical theory in the Frankfurt schools of diverse strand of thinking that all follows under the umbrella of kind of cultural critique, especially critique of late modernist capitalism, and how consumerism, in their view, has the seeds within it that actually prevent revolution. Maybe the revolution that needs to happen. So I just learned a lot more about the complexities of those arguments, their disagreements and tensions with each other, and even how the label Marxist is not quite adequate to capture, of course, is not adequate to capture all the contours of their thinking. And I learned a good dose of history behind that, like events that were happening in Europe that I wasn't really familiar with, and then how those things affected the growth of the Frankfurt School. So if you want to learn about any of that stuff, if any of that sounds intriguing to you, if you want to learn more about these figures' lives and the kind of lasting influence that they're having on our culture and our discourse today, and this is a great one-volume book to pick up for you. I would definitely recommend it with all those notes in play of those being of interest to you. So I hope you found this helpful, and I will see you for my next review.